All right, hello everyone, and welcome to lesson 3 for economics of 2026, where we're going to be looking at the law of demand. But first up, we've got our starter activity. We're going to be distinguishing between technical efficiency and dynamic efficiency. This is a 3-mark question. Whenever you get a distinguished question, what is really important with distinguish is it expects you to define or describe both terms. We rarely define things in economics, and then highlight a point of difference clearly. So it's going to mean that you need to describe or define technical efficiency, describe or define dynamic efficiency, and then explicitly point out a point of difference. So saying the difference between dynamic and technical efficiency is, or the key point of difference is, and then having that statement really, really clear. So you're going to have 4.5 minutes to do this now, and then we are going to go through a sample answer. So in terms of how to respond to this, a good sample would look something like this. So the key difference between technical and dynamic efficiency is how they aim to achieve that type of efficiency. So that's the main difference. They aim to do it differently. Technical efficiency achieves efficiency by producing at the greatest output for the lowest cost. So I always refer to this as least cost for most output. Whereas dynamic efficiency aims to change the allocation of resources to match society's changing needs and wants. So it achieves efficiency by matching society's changing needs and wants, whereas technical does it by getting greater output at a lower cost. And that is how they're different. They achieve it differently. So what we're going to be doing this lesson in Unit 3, Area Study 1, is looking at the law of demand. First up, to recap what we did last lesson, there are 4 main types of economic efficiency. There is allocative efficiency, which when we are talking about allocative efficiency, it is the only combination of production which maximizes living standards. So we could allocate our resources in many, many different ways, but there's only one perfect allocation of resources where living standards could not be higher in any other way. We talked about this a little bit with our production possibility diagram, which looks a little bit like this. And somewhere on this curve is allocative efficiency. It could be here, it could be here. It depends on the society. It really will depend on the people who live there. What they want, what they need is going to affect which point on that curve is allocatively efficient. Then we've got technical or productive efficiency. Like we just said in the starter activity, it's the lowest cost for the most output. Any point along this curve is going to be technically efficient, because that is using all of our resources to their maximal potential. So it is the most output from the resources that we currently have. Then we've got dynamic efficiency. So dynamic, like we said before, changing the combination of production to match changing needs and wants. That's going to mean moving from one point to another based on how society's changed. So it might be that initially we were producing at point B here, and then we move to point C because now society wants more of one good and less of another. So we reallocate resources to match those changing needs and wants of society. And then finally, we've got intertemporal efficiency, which is balancing resource use between now and the future. Now, this one's kind of weird because you can't really show it on the PPF that well. I guess the main thing being that we are not producing outside of the production possibility curve, like out here, because we talked about that being unsustainable. And we really don't want that because we want there to be enough resources remaining for future generations. So by producing on that curve or inside the curve, or finding ways to move our curve outwards, such as new technology or education and training to get more out of our resources, that can make us more intertemporally efficient because there are going to be resources remaining for future generations. So now on your whiteboards or on your slides, depending on what you're doing right now, what I need you to do is for each of these scenarios, I need you to tell me which type of efficiency they are. So I'll give you 2 minutes, and then we are going to go through the answers. I hope that people are pausing when I say 2 minutes. It's not just a pretend 2 minutes. All right, so let's go through these one by one. So first up, living standards are maximized and opportunity costs are minimized. That is going to be allocative efficiency. It's the only combination of production that maximizes living standards. If businesses begin to produce more electric cars based on changing needs and wants, that changing needs and wants makes it dynamic efficiency. If businesses begin to use more sustainable energy to save resources for the future, that is intertemporal efficiency. If a business produces their goods overseas to save on labor costs, that is probably going to be technical or productive efficiency because it's the least cost for the most output. And businesses reallocating resources towards the production of face masks due to a pandemic, that is going to be dynamic efficiency, or you could argue allocative efficiency. There's this weird thing with dynamic and allocative efficiency because if you are dynamically efficient, so you change production to match changing needs and wants. That is going to then become allocatively efficient because by meeting the changing needs and wants, you're now maximizing living standards. So if you achieve dynamic efficiency, you will also achieve allocative efficiency. Our other content that we went through was perfectly competitive markets. So in an unregulated market, we talk about if there were no laws, government regulations about how businesses operate, this is the basis of our demand supply diagrams, which we're going to get into today. Perfectly competitive markets are markets where there are many buyers and sellers, so a large amount of people selling products and buying products. No barriers to entry, so it's really easy to start in that business area and make that good or service. And homogenous goods, which means that there's no product differentiation. No matter who you buy from, it's basically the same thing. Always think primary goods here, like fruits and vegetables. If you go to the Queen Vic market, no matter who you buy an apple from, an apple's pretty much the same thing. The quality may vary a little bit, but you're probably going to go for the least price for the most quality. So there's an expectation that in a perfectly competitive market, consumers will be fully informed and act in a way that maximizes their utility or satisfaction. So customers are going to buy what is ever going to give them the most satisfaction. So the highest quality for the least price, they are going to go for. So let's check how well you understand perfectly competitive markets. Which of these goods is most likely to be sold in a perfectly competitive market? I'll give you 20 seconds. Really need some like hold music here, like do 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 do. All right, so you've got an answer now. You're probably holding it up. You may be holding up fingers. You may have written it on a whiteboard. But what I need you to do here is I need us to go through why each of these are or are not perfectly competitive. Look first at phones. Well, phones are not going to be in a perfectly competitive market. One reason why, branding. That means that they're not homogenous. There's also a lot of barriers to entry and exit because there's Apple and Samsung that are not going to let you compete against them. Chocolate bars, again, no, same thing, branding. It's really hard to compete. There's a lot of brand loyalty there. Soft drinks, still no, lots of branding again, but apples, on the other hand, apples are homogenous. Like I said before, no matter who's selling them, apples are basically the same. So if you said apples, good job to you. You know what would be sold in a perfectly competitive market. So to get into our new learning for today, we are going to be talking about the law of demand. The theory of the law of demand, which includes something called the income effect and the substitution effect. Now, these two things were new in the study design a couple of years ago, and they've never been asked about on the exam. And that's a worry because students struggle with them because they haven't really appeared before in the past. We're going to really focus on them because they've got to be coming up, and I put a lot of work in place to make them really make sense. We're going to look at the demand curve itself, including movements along and shifts of the demand curve and what causes those. You may have some prior knowledge of that from previous economic experience. And we're going to look at the non-price factors that shift the demand curve, including changes in disposable income, changes in the price of substitutes and complements, preferences and tastes, interest rates, population demographics, and consumer confidence, which we will often abbreviate to CONCON because it is fun to say. So get used to hearing CONCON. Our learning intention for today, as it has been for the whole topic, is to understand how resources are allocated in Australia. This time specifically for consumers and demand. What makes people demand more of something? What makes people demand less of something? Is it the price? Is it a non-price factor? We are going to look through all of that so you can be successful by showing these three things. Defining the law of demand. Very easy definition. You'll get it very quickly. And draw a fully labeled demand curve. You're going to do so many of these. You're going to be such a pro. And our third and final success criteria is to be able to distinguish between a movement and a shift of the demand curve. So, firstly, our first key knowledge point, the law of demand. What is it? Well, the law of demand, as price increases, quantity demanded decreases. So price goes up, quantity demanded goes down. If we want to abbreviate that, we could have $ up leads to QTY going down. Price goes up, quantity goes down. That makes sense, doesn't it? If things get more expensive, you want less of them because they cost you more. The opposite is also true. As price decreases, Quantity demanded increases. Things get cheaper, you want more. You get more utility out of that. Your money stretches further. It's going to really satisfy you in that way. So it's really logical sense. When things get cheaper, you want them more. When things get more expensive, you want them less. So let's just check for that. I need you to fill in this gap for me. When price rises, quantity demanded, that's right, it decreases. Good job. I assume that you said that out loud really enthusiastically. But as price rises, quantity demanded decreases because as things cost more, we demand less of them. Good job, team. Next up, in terms of drawing a demand curve, you are going to do this a lot. I'm going to draw one by hand first, then a nicer image is going to appear. But with our demand curve, we always need a y-axis, which is going to be labeled price, and an x-axis, which is going to be labeled quantity. And you can do $ and Q or QTY down here. And then a demand curve is created on this by showing the relationship between price and quantity. So when price is high, if we have price up here, quantity demand is really low because that would be like very close to zero. When price is low, so if price is over here, quantity demand is going to be really high. So we get this downward sloping curve because as if the price is set high, let's just say price is $5 here, there is going to be very low quantity demanded. However, if the price is $1, now when things are cheaper, people demand a whole lot more of them. So if we now take this away and put in a nicer diagram that I prepared earlier, it looks a little something like this. Oh, magic. So we can also have a title in here sometimes. When you get assessed, there is no mark for the title, so don't stress about it too much, but it's the market for whatever good or service is being sold. So with this demand curve, it tells us a lot of things. We just talked about a little bit of them. But when selling prices increase, quantity demanded decreases. Like our law of demand we talked about before, we refer to this as a contraction in demand. These things that we're referring to currently, we refer to as movements. So movements in demand is when the selling price changes. So movements equals a change in selling price. So if we were to look at this on the curve, let's just say, like before, we had $1 as the initial price and $3 as the price that something increases to. Initially, if we look across on the demand curve, and we call that Q1, a lot is demanded at that cheap price. However, as the price increases, this leads to us moving along that curve to a new point where there is less demand. So we're moving from this point here on the curve, and we are having a movement along the curve to this point, which we call a contraction in demand because they're now less demanded at the new price and nothing else has changed, just the price has gone up and people demand less of that good or service. Then next, the opposite. If the price is to decrease. Now, let me just erase some of my drawings here. Price decrease. Let's just change some of the arrows here. If the price is to decrease, so we go from $3 to $1, we are going to move from Q2 to Q1, and we're going to move from this point on the curve to this point in the curve. And we call that an expansion of demand because as price is getting lower, we are now demanding more. Logical, like we said before, as things are cheaper, you want more of them. What's really important here with movements in demand is that you need to use this terminology of expansions and contractions when the selling price changes. This is explicitly about selling price changing. So when the price goes up or the price goes down, this causes a movement. When the price goes up, it causes a contraction. When the price goes down, it causes a expansion. So what I need you to do now is quickly on your whiteboards in the next minute, draw a demand curve which shows an expansion in demand. So hopefully you would have drawn something that looks like this. If I was to quickly throw one together, we're going to have price, we're going to have Q for quantity, a demand curve sloping downwards. We're going to have a price here. We're going to have another price here. We're going to sketch across and go Q1, sketch across and go Q2. And we're going to show that that has had an expansion in demand. If you drew something that looked like that, amazing work. 10 out of 10. So to get into some things around our law of demand, there is this fact thing called the income effect in the study design now. The income effect refers to as a good or service gets more expensive or takes up a larger proportion of our income, we demand less of it. Again, logical, that's just that law of demand, but it's given a technical terminology now. This leads to a contraction of demand for that good or service. So like we said before, we've got our demand curve, and let's just say this is the market for ice cream, because ice cream is delicious. If we look at this market and we've got our demand curve that is sloping downwards, ice cream was $5 a tub and it has gone up to $10 a tub because the cost of living is getting crazy. As that happens, because of the income effect, ice cream is now taking up a larger proportion of our income, and therefore we are going to demand less of it. So, as per the income effect, as ice cream gets more expensive, we demand less of it as it consumes a larger proportion of our income. So what I need you to do now is on your whiteboard, describe the income effect with reference to an example. Perfect. So hopefully you described an example that's just a different food, because food is always a great example in the law of demand and microeconomics. You could say, for example, cheese is obscenely expensive. So cheese has gone up. A bag of shredded cheese is like $10.50. That's a larger proportion of income. Therefore, I demand less cheese because I'm like, I can just sprinkle a little less on my daughter's pasta. She won't know. She won't know if a few pieces are less happening there. And then because of that proportion of income cheese now takes up, I'm demanding less of it as per the income effect. Now, to test you drawing these diagrams, I need you to now draw a demand curve for the market for Pepsi Max. And if the price increased from $2 to $4.50, I need you to draw how this would appear on a demand diagram and describe the change in demand for Pepsi Max. I'm going to give you 4 minutes to do that. And now that hypothetical 4 minutes has passed, once again, hopefully you're pausing in between these things. Otherwise, that is not enough time to do things. But it's going to look something like this. We're going to have our demand curve sloping downwards. We're going to have market for Pepsi Max. Again, no marks for the title, but it sometimes helps. We've got price, we've got quantity, and then we're going to have the two prices that have been told to us. We have increased from $2 to $4.50, and we're going to have to sketch across to see what Q1 is. We're going to sketch across and see what Q2 is. And then what we need to do after that, so we can see that there's been a contraction in demand, we're going to need to describe what has happened there. So we have to say when the selling price increases from $2 to $4.50, there is a contraction in demand for Pepsi Max. There we go. And that would be perfect for that question. You'd cover all the marks. That would probably be around 4 marks at the moment. You get 2 marks for the diagram, 2 marks for the description. You're going to end up doing a lot more than that 4 marks by the time we get to the SAC. But for now, that's about 4 marks worth of quality. So if you got anything around that, amazing work. So then, it's not just always price changing that affects demand. We also refer to these things called non-price factors. So non-price factors can either increase or decrease the overall demand without price changing. This leads to a whole new demand line being created. So you can see over here, we've got our example here. And in this example on the left, you can see there's a whole new demand curve here called D2. That's a whole new demand curve where at this same price, if we look at the original price, if we have like P1 over here, you can see if price doesn't change, there's a whole bunch more demand at that same price, which is weird. Why are people demanding more even though the price hasn't changed? There's some reasons why we'll get into that. Things other than the price changing that make people want more of something. Or we could also have it shift to the left, which would be unfavorable, where there is less demand at any given price. So demand shifts can be favorable or unfavorable. What's really important here is that it's something other than the price changing that leads to a whole new demand curve being created. So now let's get into the factors that can shift demand. Some of the factors that can create a new demand curve can be things like changes in disposable income. So if you suddenly have more money, let's just say recently in the new financial year, there was a tax cut, which meant that on average, I think each pay I'm taking home like an extra $30. That means I've got more disposable income. I might buy more things. If people have a increased disposable income, that means they are likely to demand more of things at the same price because now they've got more money. If your pay goes up because you get a year older and suddenly you're earning more money, you're likely to demand more things because you feel like you are in a better financial situation. Therefore, you'll demand more of something at any given price. We've also got successful advertising. We know that social media marketing is relentless. What's important is successful advertising here because advertising can also not work. But social media advertising is relentless. Just yesterday, like Black Friday sales are coming up. I buy a lot of running shoes for long distance running. I buy these shoes from a Western Australian brand called Tarkeen because they donate a large proportion of their profits towards the environment, which I think is a good thing. I got hit with a sponsored ad. The sponsored ad was 20% off all shoes. This meant that a pair of really good running shoes that last for about 1,000K were $160 each. And it was really close. Like normally, I sometimes get them for about $140, but 160 is still a really good deal because normally they're over 200. But then they hit me with a sweetener to get me over the line. Not only were the shoes 20% off, you also got a free premium hat. And that free premium hat meant that at this same price or this price that they were at, I now demanded two pairs rather than one because like I need to get over that threshold to get that extra free hat. And so that non-price factor of the advertising is what made me demand more shoes. I didn't really need them. I've got enough. I've got spare pairs in the wardrobe. But that advertising made me buy more shoes. It can also be a change in price of a substitute item. So some items are competitors to each other, and we may buy one or we may buy the other. So if we look for example here, if we've got Coke and Pepsi to keep our examples along the line of what we had before, let's just say Coke goes up in price. So just movement in demand for Coke. But suddenly, because Pepsi is a substitute for Coke, there is now more demand for Pepsi at its current price. So that change in the price of a substitute item leads to more people demanding the other. We can also have a change in price of a complementary item. So let's just say, for example here, bread and butter go together really well. So we've got bread and we've got butter. If bread gets cheaper, so bread goes down in price. Oh no, I've lost my curve. So bread has gone down in price. Suddenly, you're going to want more butter because you don't want that dry bread, especially if you're buying like the home brand bread. You are going to choke on how much moisture that takes away from you. So you need to get that butter so it goes together. They're complementary. Bread has gotten cheaper. You now want more butter to butter that bread. Oh, there's a diagram that I drew earlier. And then we also have a few other factors here. Milk and cereal being another good example there for complementary items. We've got decreases in personal income tax. That's essentially the exact same as disposable income. You pay less tax, you've got more income. We've got seasonal changes. If we get into summer, people are going to demand more ice cream or gelato, depending on what your flavor is. Trends, so as things get more popular, maybe it's popular on social media, maybe it's really like K-pop Demon Hunters in the last like 6 months. My daughter became obsessed. It's going to really ruin my Spotify Wrapped for 2025. But these trends really kick up the demand for certain products, even though the price is the same. And finally, interest rates. Interest rates are the cost of borrowing money. They're how much you have to pay extra on top of borrowed money. If interest rates go down, people are more willing to borrow money to spend, or alternatively, they pay less on their debt and can afford to buy more things. So I need you now on your whiteboard for each of these following scenarios. I need you to tell me whether there would be a favorable or unfavorable shift. Feel free to make it F or U. That seems inappropriate, but they are letters that are useful for favorable and unfavorable. The market for bread if butter went up in price. We said before, these are complementary items. What would happen there? So butter has gone up in price. That is going to be an unfavorable shift in the market for bread. The market for ice cream on a 38-degree day. If it is hot, what are you going to do? It's going to cause a favorable shift because you want more ice cream. It's going to be refreshing. The market for Coke if Pepsi goes up in price. I'm a sucker for using examples that come up in future questions, even though I don't remember writing these questions because I did it months ago. The market for Coke, if Pepsi goes up in price, people are going to demand more Coke, so that is going to be a favorable shift because they are substitutes. The market for Bunnings, if there is a successful advertising campaign, people are going to be crazy for those Bunnings snags and tools, so it's going to be a favorable shift. The market for housing, if interest rates decrease, if it's cheaper to borrow money, people are going to want to buy houses, so that's going to be a favorable shift. And the market for food, if personal income taxes increase, well, if taxes go up, you're going to not be able to afford as much food. That's going to be sad. We're going to have to start buying cheaper food. It's going to lead to an unfavorable shift in specific foods. And then finally, the market for bananas, if their price increased. Really important here, we're talking about price here, not a non-price factor. So this is a trick question. That's right. Did you fall into my trap? This is actually talking about an expansion or contraction or a movement. If the price increases, that is going to lead to a contraction in demand, because that is a price change, not a non-price factor. So to get into a check for your understanding, could you draw a fully labeled demand curve showing the impacts of a health report being released that states kinetic sand has asbestos in it? This is how you can tell I added some of these checks for understanding recently, because this is within the last week that this happened, that all primary schools and after school care, etc., had to get rid of all their kinetic sand because it was found to have asbestos in it, which is terrifying. But can you draw this on your whiteboards in the next 2 minutes? Right. Hopefully, you know this is essentially unfavorable advertising or the opposite of a trend. We're going to have a demand curve for initially for the kinetic sand, which I'm going to call KS, price, quantity. And once they find out there's asbestos in kinetic sand, we're going to demand less of it, because I don't know about you, but I want less asbestos, less asbestos. Next, we've got something called the substitution effect. So we've got the change in price of a substitute before as a non-price factor. The substitution effect is part of the law of demand, which is very similar, but kind of works in the opposite angle. So with the substitution effect, it's all about as a good or service takes up a larger proportion of our income, we'll demand cheaper substitute goods instead. So it's all about what is happening to that initial good. So if we've got our examples from before, if we had, for example, our Coke and Pepsi, or we had, what substitute products could we have? We could have bread and wraps. Let's do bread and wraps. Let's say bread. For some reason, bread has gotten more expensive. Bakeries are just trying to gouge you for your money, and bread has gone up in price. Bread is taking up a larger proportion of your income. Now this means that something like wraps, which are a cheaper substitute, may get a favorable shift in demand because you are now demanding more of that cheaper substitute, and that is the substitution effect. As something takes up a larger proportion of your income, you want less of that and more of the cheaper alternative. So, following the substitution effect, if Coca-Cola was to increase in price, could you describe what is likely to happen to Coca-Cola and its substitute products? I'm going to give you 3 minutes to this. This would be around a 3-mark question. So what you need to do is describe what is going to happen to the demand to Coca-Cola, and then what is going to happen to demand for substitutes. It should take you about 4 minutes. All right, so what you need to do here is, with reference to the substitution effect, we're going to say that as Coca-Cola goes up in price, this is going to cause a contraction in demand for Coca-Cola. So we're going to talk about the fact that that causes a contraction in demand, because now at a higher price, takes up a higher proportion of income, people therefore want less of it. Then this is going to cause a favorable shift in demand for substitute items, cheaper substitutes, such as Pepsi. Then that would answer the question perfectly. Now, finally, we are going to get into a worked example. So I need you to distinguish, well, I need me really, because I did this. I'm going to get you to do a similar question later on. Distinguish between a movement in demand and a shift in demand with reference to examples. So again, we're looking at this word distinguish. We've been seeing it a lot. We're going to define both things or describe both things, point out a difference. In this case, we also need some examples embedded to get an extra mark at the end. So what this might look like, the difference being first. So the difference between a movement and demand and a shift in demand is what they are caused by. So that is the difference there, what they are caused by. A movement in demand occurs when a change in selling price leads to either an expansion in demand or a contraction in demand. So it gets one of those marks. Whereas shifts in demand occur when non-price factors create a new demand curve, which either represents an increase in demand, a shift to the right, or a decrease in demand, a shift to the left. For example, if the price of bananas increased, there'd be a contraction in demand, whereas if there was successful advertising for bananas, there'd be a favorable shift in demand. So what I need to do now, very similar in idea, but different concepts. So we're working on the skill of distinguishing. I need you to distinguish between the income effect and the substitution effect with reference to examples. So what I need you to do here is to describe both the income effect and the substitution effect. I need you to point out the difference between the two of those concepts, and then give some examples specifically, which is just going to really mean, as you describe them, mention products that it would happen to. So that's a 4-mark question, should take you about 6 minutes to do, and then you're going to get on to your classwork for the rest of the session. So finally, your classwork for the rest of the session is to complete the lesson 3 questions in your book. I need you to either fill in the summary notes in your booklet or create flashcards on these following key concepts that we've talked about. And then after that, you're going to be completing a consolidation activity of everything we have learned so far. Hope this was helpful. Sorry that I was away today presenting at a conference, and I look forward to teaching you next time. Goodbye.